planet is made up of 4 very different parts that all work together to make Earth the lovely place that we know it to be. We call these parts spheres, and between them, they contain all the stuff on our planet. Everything from the fish in the ocean to the air we breathe. Earth has 4 spheres: the geosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. So what exactly are the spheres? And what's in them? Let's take a look at 2, the geosphere and the biosphere. Up first is the geosphere. Geo comes from the Greek word for ground. You may have heard this before in words like geology or geography. It basically means having to do with the Earth. And in a way, the geosphere is kind of like the skeleton of our planet. All of the other spheres are built on top of it. It's made up of all the rocks and minerals on Earth, from the biggest boulders to the tiniest grains of sand. And all of the landforms that those rocks and minerals make up are part of the geosphere too. I'm talking volcanoes, canyons, beaches, mountains, you name it. If it's made out of solid Earth, it's part of the geosphere. Now, it's important to remember that the geosphere includes only non-living stuff. Living things do need to eat though, and all living things are part of another one of Earth's spheres, the biosphere. Bio is Greek for life, and like geo, you've probably heard it before in words like biology, the study of life. The biosphere is made up of many different biomes. Biomes are regions that have similar kinds of plants, animals, and other living things that have adapted to live in that particular region's terrain and climate. Deserts and forests are types of biomes. So are rainforest, grasslands, and wetlands. All of these biomes and many more make up the biosphere. Okay, now that we know what's in these 2 spheres, let's put them together and try to figure out what belongs to which sphere. Imagine a lovely forest meadow, a bird perched on a rock chirping away, a deer standing in the tall grass, a mountain standing tall in the background, and a stream flowing through the clearing. I can almost smell it. Almost everything in this scene is part of either the geosphere or the biosphere. Let's see if we can figure out which parts go into which sphere. Let's start with the geosphere. We know that there's nothing alive in the geosphere, so we can rule out all the plants and animals. Water is also part of a different sphere, but we'll talk about that later. When we take away the living things, we're left with all the solid earth parts of the scene. The rock the bird was standing on, the soil the grass was growing out of, the mountain in the distance, and the bed the stream water flowed through. So what we're left with is the geosphere. Rocks, soils, and landforms. Got it? Now let's think about the biosphere. Unlike the geosphere, everything in the biosphere is alive. So the rocks, the mountain, and the stream, they don't count. Now we're just left with the living things, the grass, the birds, the deer. Voila! You found the biosphere. The first sphere we're going to talk about is the hydrosphere. Hydro comes from the Greek word for water, and all of the water on Earth is in the hydrosphere. This means that every single drop of salt water in the oceans, but also all of the fresh water in lakes and rivers, is in this sphere. And it includes all of the water trapped in glaciers as ice, and the water held deep underground. Now, there's also water in the air around us, too, which we can sometimes see in the form of rain and snow. Those things come from clouds, which happen to be way up in the atmosphere. Our last, but certainly not least, sphere. This sphere contains all of the gases on the planet, which is fitting since atmos comes from the Greek word for air. Although we can't really see the atmosphere or grab onto it, it reaches everywhere and covers the entire planet like a giant snuggly blanket. But our atmosphere blanket isn't all the same. It's split up into many different layers. The troposphere is the lowest layer. It contains 80% of the air on the planet. It's also where all of our weather takes place. Above the troposphere is the stratosphere. There's no weather up there and much less air, but there's still important gases in it that help absorb harmful rays from the sun. The mesosphere is the coldest layer of the atmosphere and sits on top of the stratosphere. There's almost no breathable air up there, and even less in the thermosphere above it, where you might bump into some satellites flying around the planet. The last layer of the atmosphere is the exosphere. That's the highest you can go and still be on Earth. Once you leave the exosphere, you're officially in space, baby. Now, these two spheres can be kind of hard to tell apart, so let's investigate at the beach. The beach is the perfect place to take a closer look at what pieces of our environment make up the hydrosphere and which are parts of the atmosphere. The beach is, of course, right next to the ocean, and since the ocean holds most of the water on our planet, it's the biggest part of the hydrosphere. The rivers that flow into the ocean are also a big part. And so is the rain that's just starting to fall on our beach. Well, that's a bummer, but check this out. While the rain is a part of the hydrosphere, the clouds it came from are actually part of the atmosphere, and the wind that pushes the waves around is part of the atmosphere too. Even though we can't see it, the atmosphere is all around us in the form of the air that we breathe. Our planet couldn't be the amazing place we know it to be without the 4 spheres. And it can be a tough puzzle to put together, but the result is pretty amazing. I think you'll agree.
Waterworld is one of my favorite movies. Okay, to be fair, I haven't seen it since I was like 10. But besides Kevin Costner with gills, what would that kind of world actually look like? What happens when all the ice melts? Hi everyone, Julia here for D-News. Lots of headlines warn about melting ice. It's like a doomsday fanatic's fantasy. I mean, did you see Day After Tomorrow? But calm down, Hollywood. How bad would it be if the ice melts? Well, most of it's not good. Weather might look a little different around the world. As more of our sun's energy gets absorbed into the oceans, it would change the way air moves around the atmosphere in the Arctic and could even change the position of the jet stream. One study published in the journal Environmental Research Letters found that if the Arctic sea ice melts, England will probably get a little rainier. And a study published in the journal Nature suggests that the northern jet stream will shift southward, bringing cold polar air, making winters colder and snowier in North America. We could lose wildlife too, and as the ice melts at a rate of more than 86,000 square kilometers per year, wildlife is losing critical habitat. Lots of Arctic species like whales, walruses, and seals depend on the ice for protection and hunting. Some are already changing their feeding and migration patterns. Okay, I know what you really want to hear about. How will all this melting sink our cities? When talking about ice melting, it's important to make a distinction. Ice caps like the Arctic ice cap already sits on top of the water, so even if it melts while still sucking, it wouldn't contribute to sea level rise. But if you're worried about a future water world, you should be worried about ice sheets melting. Ice sheets sit on top of land and form when snow that falls during the winter doesn't melt. And with enough time and enough snow, these layers stack up and form a big, thick sheet. The two main ice sheets are the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which together contain more than 99% of the fresh water on Earth. In the Antarctic, a large ice shelf that's existed for 12,000 years is on the brink of collapse. Another study published in the journal Science found that over the past 20 years, Antarctic's floating ice shelves shrank 18%, and this melting is speeding up. New research from Princeton University shows that it's melting faster than we thought. Researchers found that in Antarctica, ice melting increased by 6 billion tons per year each year during the 11-year period the researchers examined. Scientists believe that if these ice sheets melt, sea levels will rise, devastating coastal cities around the globe. According to a study published in the journal Climate Dynamics, if all the ice in the Greenland ice sheet melts, global sea levels would rise by about 24 feet. If all of Antarctica melts, sea levels would rise by 200 feet. The entire eastern seaboard of the US would be underwater and Florida would vanish. But that's a worst-case extreme scenario. But we should still be concerned about this trend. These icy regions heat up faster than the rest of the world. To get a sense of how the Earth is warming, it's important to keep an eye on the icy parts of the world. If the ice is melting, like a canary in a coal mine, it could signal a global warming trend. And speaking of, a recent study published in the journal Nature Climate Change found that it's a positive feedback loop. As the ice melts, climate change will get worse. The ice acts as a giant reflector, bouncing sunlight back into space. But if the ice melts, more of the sun's energy will be absorbed rather than reflected, heating up the Earth more, which in turn will melt more ice. It's kind of a vicious cycle. And one country in particular is hoping that the world acts on this problem soon. Check out this video from our sister channel Seeker on how the Maldives is dealing with rising sea levels.
The Maldives nation consists of around 1,200 little islands at the intersection of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. It's also the planet's lowest country. On average, its land is only about 5 feet above sea level.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
All right, so the rock cycle for Station 14. If you take any type of rock and you expose it to the right conditions, you can turn it into any of the other two types of rocks. So for example, igneous rock is made whenever magma from underneath in the mantle comes up onto the land. It's liquid rock. As soon as it starts cooling, whether it's cooling from exposure to air or exposure to water, it turns into igneous rock. Here's an example of pumice, and then there's an example of volcanic glass called obsidian. These are cooled lava that have turned into rock. If that rock is pounded by water or scoured by wind, then it tears off little bits of sediment, and that sediment can collect and become sedimentary rock. If that sedimentary rock is melted, it can be turned back into igneous rock. So you can convert from igneous to sedimentary and from sedimentary back to igneous. Some examples of sedimentary rock are limestone and sandstone and breccia. These are all composed of pieces, sediment, chunks that have been fused together due to extreme pressure. So as something presses down on it, it squeezes it and fuses it together into a rock. Metamorphic rock is exposed to even higher pressure and greater temperatures. It's usually sandwiched in between something that's massive pressure and the mantle, which is extreme heat. And as a result of that, you wind up with rock that is extremely dense, like granite or marble or basalt. And those types of rocks are highly prized for use in statues and countertops and things like that because they're very difficult to break. But if you were to take that metamorphic rock and wear it down over time and turn it into sediment, it can become sedimentary. If you were to melt it, it can become igneous. So any type of rock can be turned into any other type of rock under the proper circumstances. If you look at the chart at the top of your page, you'll see the different arrows point to the different methods that you can use to turn igneous into metamorphic, or metamorphic into sedimentary, or sedimentary into igneous, or any combination of any of those. All right, for station 15. So card 1 is the Statue of Liberty. When she was delivered, the Statue of Liberty was the color of a brand new penny. She was copper because she is made of copper. So she was nice and shiny like this picture. Now this picture has been treated for color because back then they didn't have color photos. So this is what it looked like, or what it would have looked like if the colors had been proper. Over the 100 years that she's been sitting in New York Harbor, she's developed a patina, a kind of a greenish color, and this is like rust, but for copper. Anytime a penny has a lot of chemical weathering, because that's what this is chemical weathering, exposure to the salt, exposure to chemicals in the air, it's going to rust. In the case of iron, it rusts red. In the case of copper, it rusts green. For card 2, the Colorado River, that river running right through the middle of the picture there, has slowly worn away and eroded the rock of the Grand Canyon over the past 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years, and it's dug a channel a mile deep that is over a mile deep in some regions. And as a result of that, the Colorado River has carved through physical weathering the Grand Canyon. And all of that sediment has wound up dumped downstream in some other location. Ice breaking. This is also physical weathering. This is when water collects in a crack of a rock. It freezes, it expands, it pushes the rock wider and wider. Over time, that happens so many times that the rock winds up splitting and it breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. This is a form of physical weathering. Erosion. Whenever weathering wears away, in this case, this is an arch in Arches National Park. The rock that is in the hole was a less dense rock than the rock that makes up the arch, and as a result, the wind was able to wear out the middle before it wears out the rest of the arch. The arch is still being worn by the wind. Every year, a little bit of it is broken away. Every year, a little bit more of it is eroded, and eventually this arch will fall. So if you ever get a chance, you should make your way to Arches National Park because it won't be there forever. But this is called erosion. The last station, this is the Yellow River in China. The Yellow River collects all of the sediment that it picks up from different parts of the river, and it carries it downstream and it dumps it. In a lot of cases, it winds up dumping it at the end of the river. This is called a delta. Whenever you get all of that sediment being dumped at the end of the river and creating new land, that's called a river delta. And this process is called deposition.